Welcome to another episode of Stories from the Edge of Life. Once again, we have another special guest, somebody who is back with us, Emily Lauren Burg. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Parag. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Emily, would you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Of course. So I am a cholangiocarcinoma patient. I've actually never started a sentence like that before. So this is already a profound experience. I'm a person who's been diagnosed with stage 2 cholangiocarcinoma. I am also a former colleague of Parag's in palliative care and oncology, and worked as a hospital and hospice chaplain at several hospitals and community cancer centers on the East Coast and in the Middle East and South of the United States. And I never could have imagined that I would be somebody who had cancer. And what I learned during the past 9 months of my life is staggering, and certainly taught me that what you might experience as a clinician and what might be a successful professional endeavor does not always translate to your own experience.
Thank you, Emily. And I'm Parag Bharadwaj. I'm a hospice and palliative medicine physician in the US. And it's been that long, huh? I remember when you first called me, and it just shows. We were talking about it before the interview. When you actually know somebody, the time frames and your memory and everything is different. It functions differently. So, Emily, please share with us your experience, because you shared a little bit about how we had worked together, and tell us about what your exposure was with healthcare and cancer patients before you got diagnosed with cancer, and then we can talk about your experience.
Sure. So I worked in healthcare as a hospital and hospice chaplain and a wellness counselor from 2009 until 2015. So there had been quite a lag between my last time working in this world and my diagnosis in 2022. But I worked under Parag's guidance. He was very much a mentor to me, and he let me round with him to see patients. So I saw patients at end of life very early in my career, and that inspired me to want to do work with hospice. And of course, there's a disproportionate number of oncology patients who are at end of life. So I had special training and focus there. I went to graduate school to get a Master's of Divinity degree and become a chaplain. And when I went into private practice after that, I was referred by oncologists, or actually I should say that differently, oncologists at premier hospitals around Los Angeles would refer their difficult patients to me. Patients who needed something more comprehensive than supportive care or palliative care or pain management. And that helped me build up a private practice doing that work. I left it in 2015 and went back into the business world, which is where my roots are. But it, of course, has always stayed a part of me. And when I was diagnosed and started to walk down that path as a patient, one of the first things I thought was, I didn't know what I was talking about. How did I do that work? How did I counsel all of those people? I had no idea what I was talking about. And then I came to realize what I was able to do in that work and offer to people was share presence with them. That's what quite unique about being a chaplain, is that you hold space for people without judgment, implication, or consequence. And that is a beautiful thing to provide. And I found myself wishing for a me over the course of my experience with cancer. I never found them. I did get support and resources from other people who have cholangiocarcinoma, from a phenomenal team of physicians and supportive care doctors. But I have gone now from thinking, I didn't know what I was talking about. How did I ever really help anybody? To thinking, wow, I really would have loved somebody like me along the way, along my journey.
Thank you. And I just also want to stress that, yes, we did see very sick patients together. We also saw some very unique patients in terms of when we worked together. patients getting better and leaving the hospital too. And that was a very unique part of my professional career. And it was very nice to have you along with me at that time.
Thank you.
So tell us about, being on the other side. What was the experience like? Because you've spent so much of your time of your life in trying to support patients and their families, but here you were now with the diagnosis, and needed that support.
And I don't want to indict anyone who has been on my care team by saying I didn't get the kind of support that I offered other people. I did something very uniquely. And I'm so grateful to have had that experience. You mentioned we saw people at all stages. I witnessed my first death while working with you, which I thought was going to be this calamitous experience, and the sky was going to open, and I learned that deaths are often quite ordinary. But that has given me wisdom and fearlessness in thinking about my own death. And what I said very early on in my diagnosis was, I'm not afraid of death. I'm afraid of being a cancer patient, because I had seen how ill people were. I had seen how hard they struggled emotionally, financially, in their relationships. And I didn't want any of that. Um, and I had just taken on a very high level job 3 weeks before I was diagnosed. And I fought very hard to keep that job and to keep my illness a secret, because I didn't want to be a cancer patient. I wanted to be the CEO of a company. I didn't want to let the hospitals, the interventions, the surgeries, the recovery, I didn't want that to take over my life. But the reality is, one of the ethoses of spiritual care is the only way out is through, and that denying something only makes it stronger. And that proved to be absolutely accurate with me, that the deeper I dove into my experience and accepted, I am a cancer patient right now. I might not always be. And I can also be a lot of other things, made my experience a lot easier.
Oh, that is very powerful. And Emily, I've known you for so many years. It just feels like I'm talking to a different person. You know, of course, it's the experiences that shape you, and clearly, this experience has, uh, you know, like I shared with you earlier, it seems like you've just blossomed.
Which is a really phenomenal compliment. And I think part of that, we have talked offline about what's known as the gift of cancer. And for me, the gift of cancer, the opportunity here, has been to really connect with my authentic self and to recognize how much of how I moved through the world was because I felt I had to perform at a certain level, because I needed to impress other people, because I needed to maintain a certain status in my life. And none of that matters. It just doesn't. What matters is being able to walk, being able to eat, being able to drive, being able to walk your dog. Every morning, I wasn't able to have the dog I had serious surgery to remove a tumor and several organs, and I had a long recovery. And the surgeon told me that I couldn't walk the dog while I was recovering, in addition to not being able to do anything else, couldn't drive, couldn't do all these things. So I had to farm my dog out for several months, and getting her back was a huge landmark in my recovery. And every single morning I wake up to take her out for a walk, sometimes begrudgingly because it's early or it's raining or whatever. And then when we get outside and we start walking, I look up and I give thanks that I am able to be here doing that. Something that was not available to me, something that was not possible, and something that's so simple and people take for granted. You have a dog, you walk it. But for me, getting out of bed, getting dressed, getting the dog on a leash, and I live in a bunch of hills, walking up those hills without losing breath, without feeling pain, just being able to do that is a daily reminder to me of how important the small things are, and also how far I've come in my recovery.
Right. Yeah, it's a little bit different for me as well because I've known you personally, and uh yeah. So tell us about the time when you heard that you were in remission. How was that experience? Because I'll tell you before you elaborate. I'll tell you the text. We had a exchange of messages, and I asked you how does it feel, and you said it's the same feeling of disbelief
Mhm.
as when you were diagnosed. So
Yes.
uh, take us down that thought process.
I cried as much as I did when I was diagnosed. Um, and for a little bit of clinical context, cholangiocarcinoma does not have a cure. It has an extremely high mortality rate. Most people are not diagnosed till they're late stage 3 or stage 4. I am at stage 2, and I am maintaining with positive margins and no recurrences of the initial tumor. I had put off having a scan because I'm terribly claustrophobic and didn't want to go into an MRI machine. And also because I sort of enjoyed not knowing. I knew by how I felt and how I was capable of operating in my daily life, all the things I could do that I hadn't been able to, um, that I was doing well. My blood work was consistently doing well. So I felt confident that things were going to be okay. But revisiting, going for that scan, that is the process that diagnosed me, was absolutely terrifying. And I put it off as long as I possibly could to the end of the year so it would still be covered by my insurance. And I negotiated with my physician that they would give me the results before the holidays because I couldn't imagine sitting through the holidays not knowing. So I got a Christmas present of the physician calling me the night before Christmas and saying what the scan results were. And they said, we can call this a remission. And I started sobbing and sobbing and sobbing and apologized that I was crying so much and said, this is not something I ever thought was possible. I knew I was doing okay, but I've been walking through life waiting for the proverbial other shoe to drop because of the prognosis for this cancer, because I chose not to pursue standard of care treatment, which my physicians thought was rather a gamble, and I missed the window that would have been most successful in treating or possibly getting to an intermediary cure. Um, I've thought every day that I could wake up one morning and be sick again, and that would be it. And I didn't know how much time I had to feel well. So this diagnosis of being in remission gives me space and freedom around that and allows me to make choices about how I want the next quarter, half year of my life to look without feeling like I need to hold space for the inevitable. So that's a radical perspective change. That being said, well, I should also add a little bit of color to the story. So my fiance was out in our neighborhood, and I hung up the phone with the doctor. I ran down the hill. I ran down the street. I ran to where he was. And for as long as I've been sick, he said the only thing he wants in the world is for me to not have cancer. And I went and I met him, and he didn't know what was going on. Came outside to meet me, and I said, "You got your wish." And we both cried and cried and cried standing in the middle of the street here in Los Angeles. So I should also add to that in terms of the experience of what it has been like. And this is very personal and rather dramatic. My fiance and I have not known each other that long. We've been together for under 2 years. My diagnosis was actually made on our first year anniversary. So there's a lot tied up in that date. And when I knew that things were wrong around the time that I was diagnosed, I had less fear for myself and more fear for him. That I didn't want to leave him. I didn't want to leave him alone. Um, and I was not afraid of my own death, but afraid of the consequences of making him a widower. And that very much weighed on me during the time that I was ill, and it also influenced decisions we made about when or whether or not at all to get married. And we had really intense discussions about, what does life really mean? What do we really mean to each other? What could things look like on the other side of this? And for as difficult as it was for both of us in our own ways, it absolutely has made our relationship stronger because we stared in the face of death and gotten a reprieve.
Wow. So, Emily, one thing is for sure that, I've always known you to be a very strong person. And
Thank you.
thanks for being so candid, because the impression one gets when one listens to you is, hey, you've got everything together, right? But you've also shared moments where things were very difficult for you. It's a process, right? And it took a process for you to get to where you are right now,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
And so what were the things that helped you put the pieces back together?
Quite frankly, I think it was being able and willing and having a wonderful supportive partner with whom to discuss the reality of my death. I had this surgery that I was told was going to be curative, and it wasn't. So I was simultaneously dealing with the horrendous and highly complicated recovery from a major surgery, and then the second hit of finding out that there were still positive margins. So when I was in moments of extreme, profound, insufferable pain, and having just been told that I was still facing down a longer journey, to really be able to contemplate my death, which is something that the Stoics advise from a philosophical perspective, something in religion and spirituality is encouraged as a practice. I think doing that really was extremely helpful. I also have a phenomenal group of friends distributed around the world who showered me with so much love and support that it really just blew me away. And something I did in the vein of contemplating my own death was going into the surgery. I, quote unquote, put my affairs in order. And what that primarily involved was reaching out to everybody in my life who I loved and who was important to me, and thanking them for their friendship, thanking them for their love, letting them know what I thought was so special about them. And it gave me a sense of peace and gratitude and closure for what may have happened when I went under the knife during the surgery. That practice came from my experience in palliative care and end of life. That one of the most salient pieces of counsel I learned from Dr. Ira Byock that I've shared with people innumerable times is that the most important thing you can say at the end of life is, thank you, I love you, I'm sorry, I forgive you, please forgive me. And I took that moment to share that with a huge number of people who've blessed me throughout my life. And in return, I received an incredible amount of support that really, really helped. We'd also spoken a little bit about how I didn't want to be a cancer patient. And being a cancer patient really terrified me. I found that I could make my own way as a cancer patient. I could do it my own way. I could wear clothes that I felt really comfortable and really good in. I could, something as simple as that versus, making decisions about whether or not I wanted to pursue treatment. And also really embracing the immortality, the idea of immortality, the hope of immortality, that is just, it's a fiction that we all walk around with. So some really deep, profound psychological, philosophical, spiritual tools, resources, as well as, hearts and hands of people who I've been blessed with in my life. Those all help put the pieces back together.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. Now,
You're welcome.
you did mention that you received part of your treatment in a hospital that you worked, and there was a time when you felt like you didn't want to be seen by your own colleagues and people that you worked with. Can you share, what was going on
Yep,
in your mind
that
at the
that was
time?
a very, very interesting experience. I had never been in the hospital before in my life as a patient. I only ever worked in them. And when I did work at the hospital where you and I worked together, I don't know that I ever told you this, but every day that I would leave work, I would look up at the sky in the same way I do when I walk my dog. And I would give thanks that I was walking out of the hospital on my own accord, healthy and exactly in the same health that I walked in, and recognize what a tremendous privilege it was to be able to do that, to be an interloper in the hospital rather than to be a patient. So it was quite stunning to find myself a patient for the first time ever, and then in a hospital where I used to work, and to see how different it is to be a patient than it is to be an employee, and also to not want to confront any of my former colleagues, that I was still reeling from the diagnosis, trying to put it together, fighting very hard for myself, advocating for myself as a patient. And there just wasn't space to engage on a deeply personal level with people who I'd known professionally on the other side of the bed. You know, we've talked about how when you're practicing medicine, when you're working in healthcare, you open the door and you never know what you're going to find on the other side. You can read a face sheet, you can look at a chart, but it's never the same as the interaction you have with the person. That's part of what I really loved about the work I did. I loved just never knowing what was going to occur when I opened the door, never knowing if I'd see the patient again when I walked out. So being on the other side of that was really quite stunning. And in another hospital where I received treatment, the service of a chaplain was offered to me, and I adamantly refused it. That message was not conveyed, and one day a chaplain showed up in my room, and I completely lost it, sobbing, crying, not really successfully articulating what I felt, which was, if I'm the one receiving care from the chaplain, then I've really lost all touch and connection to my identity in the world in that way. And I really have become a patient. And that was very, very, very hard to take on.
Yeah, Emily, could you, for the sake of our audience, tell us what a chaplain really does?
Oh, sure, of course. Yep. A chaplain provides spiritual care, non-denominational spiritual care, although most chaplains are ordained or affirmed in their individual religious or spiritual tradition. They provide non-denominational spiritual care in institutional settings, including medical settings like hospitals, in the military, and in prisons. And they hold a very unique space in that uh, there are levels of confidentiality in conversations with chaplains that supersede any other infrastructural rules. That's particularly relevant in the military, where chains of command are very strict, but if somebody wants to confide in a chaplain, that stays in its own space. Um, does that answer the question? Is there more
Yeah,
that I
yeah,
could say about it?
perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, was part of your exposure to previous colleagues, I mean, was there a sense of embarrassment in terms of, what would they think of me as a patient when they've seen me as a healthy colleague?
That's a good question. It wasn't embarrassment as much as it was um, I didn't want to be the recipient of the skills and the tools that I had had great professional success in practicing. And also, um, I'm not one for sympathy. And when you tell people that you have cancer, they completely shift into a different mode. I didn't disclose in any circumstances for a very long time because that wasn't how I wanted people to see me. Only in the past few weeks, since I've been designated in remission, have I spoken broadly and publicly about having cancer and living with cancer. And it's important for a lot of reasons, I think, to show that there are many different faces of it. There are many different physical presentations of it, and to have the opportunity to disrupt people's fears and anxieties around it. Something else I saw all the time in my work, I imagine you did as well, is that if somebody had a disease, often the important people in their life fled because they were afraid it would somehow be contagious, even though cancer isn't. We see this with death as well. If somebody loses a spouse, they often lose their friends because their friends confront the reality of losing their spouse and they don't want to be reminded of it all the time. So I've been very sensitive to how I may be perceived in discussing my medical status, and also internally coming to terms with the fact that, as you and I have discussed, my medical status will be the defining factor of my life for however long I live. And as somebody who's been a high achiever, who's lived around the world, who's had great professional success, to find everything reduced to that has been a really tough adjustment to make.
Wow, thanks for sharing that with us, Emily.
You're welcome.
Now, there's been such a great flow in this interview. I just wanted to go back to one of the things that you mentioned earlier, that here you were, you had dealt with cancer patients in the past. Now you had this diagnosis, a very rare one, you know, limited treatment options. Did the thought ever cross your mind as to why me?
No, never. And that's a great question, and that thankfully is a product of my professional work, because as a chaplain, you're trained to engage with that question. Two major questions. So one is why me. The other one is for people who are really suffering and lingering in their illnesses and who want to die. Why am I still here? So having had conversations in both categories with patients over the course of my career, the the thing I found worked the most was to say, well, why not me? Why not me? It could happen to anybody. Everything happens to everybody all the time. So I'm not special. I'm not different. While I do have a rare cancer, I'm an outlier for the diagnosis and for the disease. Why not me? I really never, ever, ever thought about it, and instead focused on what my life could or would look like now and how much control I had over that, which is a tremendous amount. And I'll say this, sort of in closing, I really encourage patients to be advocates for themselves. I think especially with cancer, which is so terrifying, which is so displacing and disruptive, patients, and I, no offense to you as a physician, but patients will blindly accept whatever their physicians tell them. And as a physician that you want to give the best possible opportunities and resources to your patient. But often there's this disconnect. And it's, if the doctor says it, the patient has to do it. And I certainly saw in my own case that those two things didn't align. And I encourage everybody to be curious about that for themselves and to really advocate what they know in their heart and their gut they think is right for them, because even the smartest doctor in the world will never know you as well as you know you.
Great advice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, you have so many questions I feel like I can ask you. We have limited time.
Yes.
It's what's really interesting to me is there are two extremes of the spectrum when it comes to you, right? You were diagnosed with a very, very rare condition, but you also actually are on the far end of the spectrum way in terms of the way your outcome has come about, right?
Yes.
So it's like two very ends of a spectrum, and it's like a seesaw effect, right? Here you were, when you were first diagnosed with the condition and were given all this news, and here you are now. While you said you didn't ask, you never asked yourself that question as to why me. Do you feel lucky or special that here you are back, being able to do a lot of things that you love doing?
That's a great question, and touches on something probably for another interview, another time. as I talk about it now, and this has only happened over the course of 9, 10 months, a very, very, very short amount of time between diagnosis and intervention and surgery and treatment and all that. I look back on it with utter disbelief. And I say this all the time to my fiance. Can you believe that in the height of summer, it was 110 degrees, we have terrible air conditioning. I was trapped at home with a bag of bile duct juice around my leg and a hole in my abdomen that I had to change, manage, and deal with, that leaked, that required emergency. Like I'll just start saying these things like, can you believe it? And he'll say, yes, I can believe it. I was here. I can't believe it. I can't believe that I lived through it. And when I do call out each of those really horrific circumstances, it's with utter disbelief that it ever even happened. So that's the biggest privilege of where I sit right now, is that I have the distance to be able to marvel at it in a way that when you're in it, it's insufferable and you don't know that you'll ever get to the other side. I now sit on the other side and I can marvel at it.
Outstanding. I think we should wind up this interview on that high note.
Sounds
Other
good.
things I wanted to bring up, but perhaps that's going to be covered in a different interview if you're open to coming back.
I'm always happy to speak with you. It's a pleasure.
All right, Emily, wish you the best. And
Thank you.
we look forward to having you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Bye.
very much. Bye.